just oops. So just at the outset, this is obviously what I would term informational and educational in nature. This is not specific legal advice. As Harinder mentioned at the outset, I don't want to get into sort of specific issues here or particular situations, because on those issues, those circumstances, those situations, you should be talking to someone from an individual or particular standpoint. And I would also, I'm very glad that Victoria is here, because I think it's always very important to have that input from the institution themselves. So I appreciate everybody's input, everybody's participation today, and thanks again for having me. So I'm going to try and cover a lot of stuff in the next 45 minutes or so, and then we got some Q&A. So here's what we're going to go over. I'm going to try and run the gamut of many of the different issues that affect international postdocs and researchers. First of all, what is in front of you? And that's from a career and visa standpoint. Well, we're also dealing with the current situation, right? Well, why do foreign national researchers still need help? Ultimately, sometimes life and visas get in the way, okay? I don't have to tell anybody on this call today that it's a big issue out there, okay? It's huge. But ultimately, I'm going to talk about a few things that will hopefully allow you to navigate the visa process, how you can potentially help yourself doing so. And ultimately, at the end of the day, at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later, we all get to return to a little bit of normalcy. And I hope that these are some of the issues that will sort of potentially alleviate some concerns, but also get you better informed and educated about what's going on. So first, if this was a 1-minute presentation talking about visas, I would say, listen, sometimes you have to take a breath. Sometimes you have to be ready to be flexible as you navigate your career and visa path, okay? Because recognize that as a foreign national, sort of pursuing these avenues in scientific research, that there's going to be the potential for short, medium, and long-term goals, okay? So these are some sort of facets of your career pathway, your career development that sort of intertwine with the different visas that you may be able to utilize here in the United States. Because, well, also as you may see or hear from my accent, I'm from Ireland, I'm not a US national. So I've had a couple of those visas myself in the past. It's sort of like alphabet soup. Now, for international postdocs, without getting into the specific numbers, more than 50% of postdocs in the United States are foreign nationals. Okay, so it's a huge number, and it's a large population of individuals across the country. Now, some of you may have been here for undergraduate school, for graduate school, and depending upon when you were here, what visas you were utilizing, as earlier in mid-career researchers, you're further down your career path. So the tendency is that you will be dealing with and facing some different issues than you did earlier in your sort of educational career. Now, the main visas that postdocs and early career researchers will tend to hold and utilize will be the F1 OPT and the STEM extension, which is good for 3 years, the J1 Research Scholar Visa, which is good for about 5, and then the H1B that's good for up to 6 years. So conservatively, an individual can utilize up to 14 years of temporary visa. Now, I know and I understand that not everybody does this. People approach this in different ways, but that's what's there in front of you as you finish your PhD. So who can help? Who can help you? Because you got to make sure that you do reach out for help on your visas and on these other issues that are affecting you. Well, in academia, and I think as Victoria mentioned, you're still under the umbrella of the international office, okay? So it's very important to stay in touch with them, with regards to any questions about your visa, any questions about your status, etc. What about the career office? Some of these questions and issues are sort of intertwined. They go hand in hand together. And what about your postdoc office or other networking organizations? They should be proactive, just like today, okay? So it's important to remember that there are resources out there that can be beneficial to you, okay? And I'm gonna sort of reiterate and say again that especially in the academic environment, the resource of having the international office, or as Victoria mentioned, and forgive me if I don't get the title exactly right, but global affairs and things like that, these offices, these portions of the organizations are here to help you. So just remember that. And what do these sort of departments, what do these offices do? Well, they be proactive. They organize seminars and programs. They will keep abreast of changes to help you, okay? So you know, later on, I'm going to mention, I always get the questions, well, where do I go to? Where do I go to get the good information? You can go to these offices, you can talk to the individuals who are there to help you. And out of all the years I've had the good opportunity to be involved with, as Harinder mentioned, for example, the National Postdoctoral Association, and presenting seminars and presentations just like we're doing today. The people in these fields are really there. They have your back, okay? They're really there to help you. They're there to provide good information for you. So I can't sort of stress that enough. So get the basic knowledge, stay informed, and it's ultimately going to help you make informed decisions as you navigate all this, because this is a journey, okay? This is a journey. These are avenues, again, not necessarily a one-size-fits-all journey that everyone will take. So there's going to be different sort of ways to navigate all this. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't sort of start with what we're dealing with right now. Now, this has been obviously quite a fluid situation. It has been quite a fast-moving situation over the past, 3+ months. So I'm going to try and sort of give you the editorial summary of the most relevant and pertinent issues that I have been hearing, that I have been seeing, and that I have been aware of with regards to the international postdoctoral and researcher population over the past sort of 3+ months. And in the current situation, again, just to reiterate, it's, I think, vitally important to keep in contact with your visa sponsor, okay? Having the conversations, because there have been some procedural changes. Generally speaking, for example, if you are here on a H-1B, you are authorized to be employed in a certain location, undertaking certain duties at a certain wage. Well, generally speaking, that location isn't at home in your living room. So there's been procedural changes, and therefore keep in contact with your visa sponsor to make sure that what you are engaging in is still appropriate and is still authorized. You always have to be careful about unauthorized activity that could negatively affect your status in the future. Now, obviously, one of the biggest issues over the past 3 months, and I'm not even getting into the travel ban yet, but is the idea of actual international travel. So if, for example, a status was expiring, what do? Because you can't travel internationally. So there is the idea of potentially filing for an extension or a change of status. You could put on a short-term application to B2 or something like that to sort of make sure that you're maintaining some type of valid status here in the United States as we work our way through the pandemic situation. Now, a couple of things to say about USCIS, and I think there's been a bit of a miscommunication about what's been going on over the past 2 to 3 months. Now, the field offices, the local offices that do in-person interviews and things like that have been closed. It shouldn't be news to anyone. They've been reducing and stopping any in-person contact. However, since this all started back in March, the USCIS service centers that adjudicate, process non-immigrant and indeed immigrant green card applications here in the United States have continued to be open and have continued to accept and process cases. Okay, premium processing is back on a rolling basis. I think now everything's back in play, so that should be fine. However, as we move forward from here, I think we have to be ready for processing delays. So I'm going to stress that prepare early for any applications, prepare early for any cases, processes, applications that you are hoping to file and receive a benefit for. USCIS, it's just not noted here, but I'll say it, USCIS are in significant financial trouble right now. They are a self-funded agency. All the filing fees that people pay go to what runs USCIS. They don't have the money to do it right now. Congress, shockingly, are dithering in terms of whether they will fund USCIS. So they are potentially looking at furloughs for their staff. The knock-on effect of that will be lack of staff. The knock-on effect of that will be significant increase in processing times, in my opinion. Now, the next step is, what about the presidential proclamation? Now, what I will suggest is that this affects people currently outside the United States. I'm not exactly sure of the makeup of the audience today, whether you're here physically present inside the United States or outside. So this may or may not affect you in its current form, okay? So generally speaking, the current orders affect people who are physically located outside the United States, waiting to be issued their green cards and certain temporary visas. This does not currently affect internal applications here inside the United States. The other thing that's important to note for researchers is that visas are still being considered and issued to those who are working to treat or mitigate the effects of COVID-19. Okay, so it's not that there's a blanket ban on visas. There are certain exceptions. There is a discretionary policy at consulates and embassies. But ultimately, given all of these changes, I think reviewing the law and the regulations with a professional or someone who is well versed in either an office, could be an attorney or whomever, is important so that you know exactly where you stand. So I'm going to say a couple of things, and again, I'm going to sort of try to get the information across while also maintaining a more general sense. So the review of the regulatory changes, there is the allowance of regards to international students and scholars to study and work remotely. And there is the ability, under certain circumstances, to allow current international students to maintain status from within their home countries, and a relaxation on the regular OPT requirement of the number of hours per week of employment that is required. Okay. There are certain automatic extensions of DS 2019s for students and scholars. Again, I'm not necessarily getting into the nuts and bolts of this because a lot of this can be asked of and discussed with the international office. With regards to USCIS, generally speaking, most applications required an original signature. There has been a relaxation of that, and USCIS have been accepting copies of original signatures for all applications being filed. Okay. There is allowance of the use of electronically issued and signed I-20s and DS 2019s, and there's some additional I-9 flexibility for in-person document verification. Okay, so there have been some sort of expansions of discretion in response to the sort of COVID-19 pandemic. This is a big one. Okay, where are we today, and where are we going with regards to the executive orders and the presidential proclamations? Okay. We first had the limit on the permanent resident processing that was April 22nd, and then just very recently had the expansion to the H-1Bs and other visas on June 24th. Okay, I'm going to say a couple of things about this executive order and what this presidential proclamation is and what it pertains to. Okay, so first of all, it pertains to the processing of immigrant and non-immigrant visas at US embassies and consulates, okay? This does not affect people who are here within the 50 states. This is people who are outside the United States. It's important to note that traditionally and historically, the Office of the President has had authority to regulate the entry of aliens to the United States. Therefore, this presidential order or presidential proclamation is utilizing what we call Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act. This relates to the entry of aliens who are considered to be detrimental to the United States. However, and without saying the first time, but however, this administration, and this is generally utilized under a national security or public health facet, this administration is utilizing the idea of the entry of certain aliens as a negative impact upon the labor market. Okay, so that's what's going on here. And it's important to note that this does not currently affect any ongoing immigrant visa applications such as adjustment of status or non-immigrant visa applications whereby people are filing for a requested benefit here within the United States. Okay, this is affecting people located outside the United States and the inability to obtain visas to return. Now here's some of the potential known and unknown next steps. What we know, okay? We know that premium processing has resumed. We know that field offices are reopening and that the USCIS as a business, as a government entity and agency are now back in business. Things are starting to roll along and that they have not closed completely during the pandemic. Yes, we have seen processing delays, but as I previously noted, we know that service centers have continued to process applications here in the United States throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's important to note that. What else do we know? This administration a couple of years ago put down an order that all employment-based green cards would require a final interview. Now, under COVID, the situation has led to the administration waiving final interview requirements for certain employment-based cases. Okay, so it may be that the service centre may be able to administer, finalise and approve a final green card without a person appearing in person. However, interviews are restarting. Just yesterday, I got my first new in-person interview notice for one of my cases, and they're restarting on Monday, July 13th. Okay, so we're going to see to what extent USCIS move forward with in-person interviews, or which cases will continue to be processed, administered, and ultimately approved by the service centre. What are the unknowns? Okay, we don't know what the SEVP plans are for the fall, that we mentioned that on the earlier slide for the summer. Now, here's one of the big ones. There has been a lot of talk and a lot of discussion about OPT. Okay. Again, I'm not necessarily here to make predictions, but what I would say is that one of the differences between being here in the United States and holding OPT is that optional practical training is what we would call a codified benefit. Okay. It's listed in the Code of Federal Regulations, and it was codified by Congress. Okay. So the question will become, if this administration wishes, wants, or hopes to rescind OPT, can they rescind a codified benefit that was approved by Congress? This is not going to be necessarily as easy as saying, I am not going to admit someone outside the United States. I'm not going to issue a visa, because as noted on the previous slide, the Office of the President has authority to restrict the entry of aliens. Can they rescind a codified benefit that was processed and administered under the authority of Congress? And that'll be an interesting one to see. I know we've heard a lot of talk about it, but let's see how it plays out. So that's the current state of affairs under the current pandemic and with regards to the presidential proclamations. However, how does this play into the visa issues and questions that people need to still continue to deal with as we navigate life, as we navigate careers, as we navigate our US immigration history? Okay, so basically I'm going to walk through the next few slides fairly quickly. Okay, I could probably do a whole seminar on F1s and OPTs, but all I'm going to say is a couple of things. Talk to your international office. Okay, they have great knowledge, they have an excellent knowledge base, they are there to help you. Okay, they are your friend in terms of assisting you with questions and concerns about OPT and about STEM extensions. The one thing I would suggest in terms of certainly the OPT and the STEM extension is sort of to be careful a little bit if you leave academia. While the OPT and the STEM extension grants you broad authority to be employed in a position relevant to your field, if you utilize that visa or that employment authorization to leave academia, it may restrict next potential steps, i.e. J1 research scholar visas are much more prevalent in academia than industry. And obviously under the H1B, we look at the cap versus academia being cap exempt. So it's just a couple of things to think about. What about the J1s? Well, the J1 research scholars heavily utilized for foreign national postdocs and earlier career researchers in academia. There's a lot of things to like about it. You don't necessarily have to deal with USCIS, and generally speaking, from a sort of paperwork standpoint, it's fairly easy to administer and is transferable within an academic setting. However, if you are going to obtain and or utilize the J1 research scholar visa, I think you always have to be aware of section 212E, which is the 2-year home residence requirement. So if you are on your country's skills list, or for example, you've got government financing, then there's a strong likelihood under government financing, almost certainly you will be subject to 212E, that you have a 2-year home residence requirement that you either need to obtain a waiver of or fulfill before you can get a H1B or a green card. But again, in a university and an academic setting, this is a heavily utilized visa for foreign national postdocs and earlier career researchers. This is an exchange visitor program, okay, good for up to 5 years. And so therefore it sort of fits fairly well. The next visa that is, as I mentioned, if we look at this as a sort of logical sort of career path, the logical next step would be to then take the H-1B visa. A couple of things just to say about it is we look at cap exempt H-1Bs versus cap subject. And if you are working in an academic setting, you are exempt from cap. Okay, a academic institution can file a H-1B for you at any time. Not so industry. Industry, the H-1B is subject to a cap. I think it's important to note that in the context of the current presidential order, looks like J1 research scholars are not subject to this. Okay, the J1 has a number of programs, including interns, trainees, teachers, camp counselors, au pairs, etc. They're all subject to the suspension of issuance of visas. J1 research scholars are not, so they're not covered by the presidential proclamation, which is a good thing. That's a boon for researchers. Under the H-1Bs, however, the H-1Bs are generally covered by the presidential order, and so therefore one would have to see whether if you were hoping to obtain a H-1B and or enter the United States, you would have to see if you're covered under the national interest exemption, which could be whereby the applicant's work is critical to defense, law enforcement, diplomacy, or national security of the United States, or generally speaking, are involved with the research into or mitigation of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's a sort of quite a fluid and discretionary situation. Other visas, and important to note that again, if you have extensive professional research credentials and you have an excellent professional attributes, you may qualify for an O1. The O1 again is not covered by the presidential proclamation. So if, for example, you're stuck outside the United States because your department or your lab wants to bring you back on a H-1B, but the research that you are doing is not covered by the national interest exemption, you're not doing anything related to COVID, etc., then the O1 could be an option there, okay? But again, it's important to note that's got very high level of standards of adjudication, so just important to note there. TNs available for current Canadian and Mexican citizens, and we would have to, they look like they're not covered either. So again, looking at the different options that are available for entry to the United States, the big ones right now is the H-1B, the J visa under certain circumstances, and the L visa. The E3 is for Australian nationals. And again, the caveat here is I did a webinar a few weeks ago about the issues surrounding COVID and things like that. Issuance of visas is down approximately 93% at US visas and embassies since January. So there's huge numbers in terms of the decline in issuance of visas. And so therefore, I feel that regardless of where this goes, there's going to be significant delays in even being able to get yourself in front of a consulate officer to be able to hopefully obtain a visa. So therefore, I think, unfortunately, whether you're here in the United States or waiting outside, right now you probably potentially feel more constrained with regards to your visa situation than maybe ever before. But I think it's important, and I want to provide some positive feedback here. Listening to Victoria a little bit just before we started, she emphasized, I think, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but talk about the global nature of science. And I'm a firm believer in that, okay? And what I would also suggest is in the years I've had the good opportunity to work with the MPA, to engage and liaise with scientific researchers and people on the university setting, that this is a global profession. And the other thing is that in terms of foreign nationals who are either residing in the United States or are potentially outside the United States but are waiting to come back, in many cases, as highly qualified individuals who are undertaking research and or other endeavors that is recognized for its importance to the United States, that you guys may well have options moving forward that others do not. Okay, and I talk about that in a broader sense of foreign national professionals in the United States, okay? And I know it's not easy, but I think that it's important to keep that in mind, that the professional background, the professional credentials, and the professional attributes that the foreign national researchers bring to the table in the United States are indeed recognized for their importance and their significance to this country. So ultimately, as you navigate the pathways from sort of temporary visas through, under a longer term scenario, the question is, do you want to be here permanently? Do you want to be here on a green card, or do you want to return to your home country? And there's no sort of right or wrong answer. And today I'm not going to get in them, these are just informational slides. But you would look at potentially employer sponsored green cards versus self-petition green cards. And as I said or as I didn't say yet, but as was noted on the last slide, in whatever sort of position you find yourselves in, and I'm assuming that today this is mostly academic researchers, I think having conversations with your employer at an appropriate point in the process is a good idea, okay? Because you want to sort of see how this is going to play out for you and for them in the longer term, okay? You don't want to necessarily, run yourself out of time on a visa. Now, with that being said, personally, I don't think it's the best idea to sort of get into H-1B status and go knocking on somebody's door on day 2 asking about a green card. But I will defer to people's own sort of personal decisions. But I think at some point, as you navigate your career, as you navigate your visas, it's a good idea to have these conversations so that everybody knows where they stand. The options for employer-sponsored green cards, which in an academic setting is under the purview and under the authority, generally speaking, of the International Office, would be either PERM, but under a university setting, they can undertake PERM special handling, or outstanding researcher, the EB-1B. And these are the types of discussions, if this is potentially going to be on the table, you have that discussion with your international office, with the department, bring the different interested parties together so that you get a firm sort of feedback and understanding where everybody sits. But what about self-petition green cards? Is this something that you can take a step for yourself in terms of your sort of career development under the long term, as I mentioned at the outset of this sort of discussion, the short, medium, and long-term goals, right? Well, I'm just going to mention this because certainly in the current climate, I think it's clear that there are a number of people, unfortunately, have lost jobs and have lost positions in the United States. So we don't know how things are going to look on the back end of this in terms of potentially being sponsored for a green card. So can you help yourself? Can you help yourself as a foreign national here in the United States? Well, what it comes down to is, therefore, can you sponsor yourself for a green card? That's what it is. That's the question you're asking. Well, the next logical question is, well, do I qualify? And am I qualified? Well, I think it's fair to say that you need strong professional credentials. The importance of the research work in and of itself is not enough. I have a lot of conversations with earlier career researchers, mid-career researchers, and they show me their CV and they ask me to give them an evaluation of their credentials. And one of the things to remember as you potentially approach a self-petition green card, and I'm going to talk about this a little more in the next few minutes, is what I like to tell people at times is all research is important, but not necessarily, all research is not necessarily significant. And it's important that you have those strong professional credentials behind you. And therefore, prepare yourself and be ready if this is a step that you're going to take in your sort of career development, in your visa journey, etc. And I'll expand upon that in a moment. One of the things and one of the benefits about the ability, I suppose, to potentially file for a self-petition green card is you're not tied to any specific employer. They do not have to file on your behalf. You're the one driving the process. And therefore, you can, as long as you have ongoing employment, keep in mind, you've got to be maintaining a valid non-immigrant status as you navigate all this. But you need to show the intent to continue working in your field in the United States. Now, I think it's important that in the current climate, it's important to note that you actually do not have to be physically present in the United States to file this type of application. You can actually apply from overseas and then ultimately come to the United States or come back to the United States with your green card. So if you had to leave, or if for some strange reason this presidential executive order, this proclamation became a longer term situation, this could potentially be a way to ameliorate that, to navigate a green card application from abroad and then ultimately return in the future. But we'll have to see, I think, how the world turns over the next number of months before we really know where we stand on some of that. The two applications that one can apply for is extraordinary ability and national interest waiver. And again, I want to leave sort of due time for questions, so I'm just going to run through this fairly quickly. This is a very significant standard to meet. You've got to have very high professional credentials. You've got to have a lot of substance in your background. Okay, there's a number of criteria. You've got to meet at least 3, and then show ultimately by a totality of the circumstances that you're recognized as one of the few at the top of your field. Can you show sort of sustained national or international acclaim? Can you show what I would term a consistent career of excellence in addition to having met at least 3 of these criteria? Generally speaking, a more appropriate standard for many earlier mid-career researchers is the national interest waiver. So what is it? Well, it's also a self-petitioned application. We don't look at the sort of the categories as listed under extraordinary ability, but here we sort of review your work in a sort of cumulative and more broadly based basis, I suppose. Now, one of the things I would say is the mere act of publication in and of itself is not enough. As researchers, you are it's inherent in your profession to publish, present, and disseminate your findings, okay? So that's part and parcel of what you do. So again, it's just the fact that you published or presented in and of itself will not be enough. However, again, you are the one driving your process in terms of this application, okay? So it's important to note that. What's the test for this one? The test here is, as you will see, significantly different from extraordinary ability. We don't need to show that we're one of the few at the top of our field. We don't need to show sustained national or international acclaim. We need to show a 3-part test that was issued by a court about 3.5 years ago. First of all, you need to show that your endeavor carries substantial merit and national importance, which should be fairly, I don't want to say easy, but fairly doable for any researcher doing important scientific work. But then you got to show that you would be well positioned to advance the proposed endeavor and that ultimately it would be beneficial to the United States to waive requirements of a job offer and labor certification. Now, what do we look for there? We're looking for sort of impact and influence on the field. We're looking at things like citations, but also cover articles, editorial highlights, what are the standards of your publication, the rankings of your journals, etc., and the ability of others to sort of utilize and implement your findings in their own. Okay. Ultimately, how well positioned are you to continue to advance the field? How strong is your case? Again, I think in the current climate, we don't know what's around the corner. We don't know what the labor market is going to look like in 6, 12, or 18 months. Okay, so if you had or have the ability to potentially navigate by yourself, it could be a boon. It could be an additional option. So what do you need to bring to the table? Well, you have to have a solid publication record. But I think it's important to look at quality over quantity, okay? You need to be published in Nature, Cell, and Science. Luckily not. Certainly it helps, but it's not required because you need to remember what your specialty is, okay? The burden is on you, but you also get to frame the argument in terms of providing a proactive discussion, communication, argument as to what your specialty is and how your findings and how your contributions have advanced the field. So obviously, while publishing in Nature, Cell, and Science is very helpful, it's not required to have a strong application. We do like to say recognition from others in the field. Again, the sense or the idea of having published, having presented, having disseminated, but generally speaking, it takes a little bit of time for the sort of significance of that work to percolate out there. So that's also important. And this is where I get back to that sort of note that I mentioned. Yes, all the research is important. No, not all the research is significant. And generally speaking, we want to see some sort of corroborating, supporting information, material, or documents which would infer that level of significance of your research in order to start strengthening the case. Can you peer review? Does it make you a better scientist? Does it make you a better researcher? Not necessarily. But if you were to reach out to a certain journal and then peer review on a number of occasions, could it make a difference to an immigration officer that was on the fence? It could. I'm not saying that this is the strongest or the evidence that carries potentially the most weight in an application, but yeah, it could sort of sway an officer who's on the fence that as an expert in your field, you've gone and done this on a number of occasions. I've had the good opportunity to work with and liaise with many different individuals in different facets of this area, of this field. And I think that it's important to establish and maintain solid professional relationships in your professional life, okay? You know, I know that postdoc offices, postdoc associations, and offices that are similar in nature, for want of a better term, have done so much to advocate for postdocs and early career researchers over the years. And you know, I'm not here to say what the experience is, but I think that having sort of had the good opportunity to engage with so many of you guys over the years, that the experience for postdocs and early career researchers or early mid-career researchers has been enhanced by what offices and individuals have done on your behalf. But use those professional relationships, because one part of an application is getting expert opinion letters. Do you have the basis, therefore, to talk to your PI, to talk to your lab chief, to talk to your department head potentially, and obtain letters from him or her that could help your application, that could serve to confirm or corroborate that evidence that was in the record? Okay, so that's the sort of basis of what the application process is. But again, as we sort of, or as you guys apply your scientific knowledge in different ways, I think it's fair to say that over the last number of years, we've seen the application of scientific knowledge become more expansive into different career paths. It could be more entrepreneurial in nature. It could be more industry science-based. Obviously, we continue to see the academic pathway. But the idea of transitional and non-traditional careers under self-petitioned applications is a door that is open to you and that you can utilize. You just got to make sure that there's enough of a nexus between your research and the application of your scientific knowledge therein. So I'm going to start finishing up now about some of this is more sort of informational, a little bit of housekeeping, just so you get a bit of a handle on, well, how am I affected? What does this process do? What do I need to know? So we've sort of navigated what the current climate is. We've navigated how that has affected some of the different temporary visas. We've looked at how maybe you can help yourself through a permanent application, through a green card application. So let's say you've sort of navigated that and you've maybe been approved for a green card. Are you going to get it or not? Well, the United States only gives out a certain number of green cards each year, okay? So retrogression basically means that over the past 10 plus years, certain countries have heavily oversubscribed green cards more than others. In effect, India and China. And so therefore, there's a waiting period. You can always apply for the green card. You may not always be able to get it in the immediacy depending upon where you are from. And so what that means is we look at the visa bulletin that is published each month. There's 140,000 employment-based green cards given out each year. Sounds like a lot. This country's got about 350 million people in it. And also, those are broken down into different employment-based categories. So I'm going to reference the categories that are most relevant to the audience today. So in the July 2020 visa bulletin, and just to complicate matters further, there are filing dates and there are final action dates. For today's discussion, I'm only going to talk about the final action dates. For EB1, that means EB1A, extraordinary ability, EB1B, outstanding researcher, even EB1C, multinational executive or manager. For everyone, except for those born in India and China, the dates are current. What that means is that you can apply for an EB1 application and you can either apply concurrently, or if the EB1's approved, file for your adjustment of status. Not so for India and China. China, and these are born in China, born in India, born in mainland China. For China, it's August 22nd, 2017. India, May 8th, 2017. What that means is that, as it says here in the middle of the slide, the date must be current, or you must have reached your priority date at the time of filing to file an I-140 based upon your, to file your I-485 adjustment of status based upon the I-140, okay? And it's got to have been current at the time you filed it, current or reach your priority date at the time you filed it, and for final approval and issuance of the green card, okay? So we'll get back to the dates. EB1's not bad, right? It's not horrible. Then we go to EB2. EB2s cover NIWs and PERM. All countries, if you're like me, you're born in Belfast, Ireland, Northern Ireland, it's current, right? It's potential seeing some backlogs, but most of the time that stays current. All countries are not overly utilizing their visas. China, you're looking at about nearly a 5-year backlog, November 8th of 2015. India, the numbers are significantly backlogged. You're looking at July 8th of 09. For nationals of India and China, you can strategize. You can hold your place in line by filing an EB2 and then subsequently filing an EB1. There's some sort of movement of priority dates that you can utilize. Can't really get into it here, but it's something to think about as you navigate this process. So 1 or 2 to go, and then we'll hand it over. So ultimately, I think you got to be mature to look at this pragmatically. It's not an easy process. You know, there are difficult issues and some difficult hurdles, and it's possible that not everyone may work it out. But I think if you prepare yourselves and learn what is in front of you, I will say it again, okay? That science is recognized for its importance in this country, and so are international researchers. I know sometimes it feels that that's not the case. I know that there's been significant pushback recently on visas and travel bans, etc. But I have been heartened to see, for example, some of the press releases. I have been heartened to see some of the statements that are coming from scientific organizations, that are coming from prestigious universities, that, you know, people are supporting the international population. And again, I'll say it again, you guys are highly qualified individuals, okay? And ultimately, I think with the proper guidance and by following these paths, you can get to where you want and where you need to be. So just final housekeeping again, because my hope is that you walk out of here better informed than you walked in. Travel ban, and that's the original travel ban, not the new one. You got to be careful about that. That's why I always say, you know, talk to the international office. And I think in the current climate, the idea or ability to travel it's going to be a difficult call moving forward from here. Any visa appointment that you have to make, notwithstanding COVID and the current pandemic, even if you're engaged in the delegate field, make it well in advance. But again, I think we're going to be looking at significant processing delays moving forward from here. Here's a couple of important ones, and then I have one more slide. If you, for example, were unfortunate or maybe stupid enough to get a DUI or a DWI, I want to say that you do not need a conviction for your visa to be revoked. Okay, so I shouldn't be sitting here or standing in front when I do these things in person and say, don't drink and drive, but don't drink and drive. Because if you get a DUI or a DWI, your visa can be revoked. You may be required to depart the United States, present yourself to a physician, and then ask for a new visa. And you don't even need a conviction, okay? You just need an arrest for that to happen. We are in an era of extreme vetting, so if you are going to travel internationally and you can get that visa, that's a lot of ifs, buts, and maybes right now. You also have to be aware that we're in an era of extreme vetting at the border. Finally, as Harinder noted at the outset, yep, that's where I live. It's a long way from you guys. And sometimes I wonder what they do, if anything, in that building. But I think it's fair to say that immigration is the hot potato, right? So here's a couple of sort of final points. There is a Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act, which if passed and signed into law, could potentially look at removing per country limits. My guess is that if that happens, the backlog for Indian and Chinese nationals will be significantly reduced, whereas backlogs for other countries could increase. So we're just going to have to keep an eye on that and see what happens. There is immediate danger, and I've had this line on my slide now for about the last 2 years, and this could happen any day, or it might not happen. H4 work authorization, whereby mostly for Indian and Chinese nationals, the spouse of the H1 has, under certain circumstances, as a H4 holder the ability to obtain work authorization, it's in danger of being revoked. And I keep seeing immediate danger, but they haven't revoked it yet. But with that being said, yes, immigration is a hot topic. Yes, there's a lot of talk about it, but some of the rhetoric may not affect you, okay? Just keep in mind, I think there was some misconceptions about when this presidential proclamation and when this order was rolled out. It's affecting people outside the United States. The request for an immigration benefit here internally in the United States is not currently affected. So wait for the real, actual information. And I know that this is an extremely fluid and fast-moving situation, but try not to buy into the rumors and the conjecture, okay? But with that being said, prepare yourselves, and any issues, questions, concerns, I again urge people to reach out to international offices, reach out to other offices within your academic institution, etc., because you need that actual, real information to make good, informed, and educated decisions. And with that, I thank you again for having me. It's been weird doing all these webinars the last couple of months, but again, thanks a lot, and I'll hand it back to you for some Q&A. And I guess I'll stop my share.
Thank you, Brendan. This was very helpful, very comprehensive. In fact, while you were talking, we had a lot of questions. So Anka and I are probably going to distribute it and go by. Anka will take all F1 and OPT questions, and J1, and maybe I can get onto H1B and green card questions. There are some questions related to current environment, but I just want to confirm one thing. There's some related questions. People who are already in the country and they are transitioning from J1 to H1, are they getting affected? Or people who are on H1 and they have just changed their job and the new employer is filing for the H1, are they also getting affected? I think that will answer some questions here.
Yeah, so the current state of affairs, as I understand it, is that so let me just backtrack a little bit. When you request a benefit, when you as an individual or an applicant are physically present in the 50 states within the United States, you are under the jurisdiction of USCIS. And therefore, when an application is filed on your behalf, the petitioner and you as the beneficiary or applicant are in effect requesting an immigration benefit to be administered and processed by USCIS. And if a change of status, for example, is approved, then that may not be or would not be negatively affected. If an application was approved but a change of status was not granted, then yeah, you could be affected negatively by this. The other problem is that over the last, I think, almost 24 plus hours, there seems to be, which is not unusual when we hear and are issued with some of these executive orders, there seems to be some discrepancies as to, because when the order came out, and I'm just going to actually read here from the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and I can share this document with you, Harinder. Actually, it's a nice editorial summary of what transpired on June 24th. That the proclamation will only apply to an individual identified above, i.e. H1B, H2, J, L, if they are outside the United States on the effective date of the proclamation, do not have a non-immigrant valid visa that is valid on the effective date of the proclamation, and do not have an official travel document other than a visa. So the inference was that if you had a valid visa stamp, for example, that you may be able to actually travel. But we're seeing a lot of discrepancies here. So I think right now, and I don't know if, even if Victoria wants to chime in at some point, or if anyone else, it's almost like hit the pause button right now, because the last thing you want to do is get stuck.
Great. Thank you. I think there's one more question about, okay, I have some, there are some questions related to that. There are a lot of people who were already on visa and they traveled back home for during the vacation time. And I think some of them had plans to renew, just like they had the work authorization, but they wanted to get a stamp by going to the embassy. Now they is that going to happen? Are the embassies going to be processing people who were already on work authorization, but they just come back for visa stamping, whether it's J1 again or H1 again?
Well, I think that's going to depend upon which visa. So again, from my understanding of this proclamation, so if, for example, you were a J1 research scholar visa, and I think, again, it's important to note that, so the J1 research scholar does not entail one having work authorization. One is, in effect, authorized to be engaged in research pursuant to the DS 2019 that is issued as part of the J1 being the exchange visitor program. That's, yes, it gives one the ability to engage in research as a J1 research scholar, but it's not overtly termed work authorization by USCIS. It's sort of, so if, for example, that individual was here in the United States as a valid J1 non-immigrant pursuant to having a valid DS 2019, but needed a new visa for returning, that person should be okay to get a visa, because a J1 research scholar is not, to my knowledge, as of 4 p.m. Eastern today, covered or precluded by the travel ban. Now, and this is where it's going to get, or potentially is sticky for other individuals who are stuck outside the United States. Let's say, for example, you had been on a H-1B and your status had been changed from J1 to H-1B, right? And let's say the I-129 that was issued to you changed your status. Therefore, you are employed as a H-1B, what we call incidental to status. That I-129 that was approved with that new I-94 at the bottom of it, in effect, authorized you that you were in H-1B status and authorized to be employed as a H-1B non-immigrant. Once you leave the United States, however, you need a new visa to come back. If that's the case for that person, they could be stuck. Because if they are not falling now within one of the exceptions, then it is every possibility that an embassy may not issue them a visa, even if they are doing important scientific research. Now, again, it's not the time, place to get into what the possibilities are vis-a-vis discretionary visa appointments, etc. But I think, unfortunately, anyone who's currently outside of the United States waiting to be issued a visa should look at this from a very individual standpoint.
Great, thank you. Anka, do you want to go ahead with the set of questions you have?
Yes, thank you. A first question that's being asked is, if you're a new postdoc and you haven't been able to arrive in California or in the US yet, is it possible, like from an immigration standpoint, legal standpoint, can you start working even though you're still outside of the country because, you know, you can't get the visa because the consulate is closed?
Yeah. So let me just say a couple of things about that. So first of all, it's difficult in this context for me to answer specific sort of questions that are covered by regulation. I much prefer, both professionally and indeed more importantly for the person getting the information, that those are questions, first of all, that should be, we should do our due diligence, whether they want to talk to me, or for the most points they can talk to an international office who can usually provide them that information. So that's my preference. What I will say, however, is what I mentioned, as I mentioned in the presentation, in the webinar, one of the things you have to be careful about is the idea of engaging in what I would term unauthorized activity, right? Well, if you are engaged in whatever that activity might be, but you're outside the United States, you're not engaging in activity that would negatively affect your US immigration status because you're not engaged in that activity while you're physically present here. So I think that that would be a question. My view would be, bring in the interested parties. And again, what I'm probably hearing, or I'm going to surmise here, is probably the individual or the applicant, the lab or department in the international office. That's where they should have that discussion. But again, at the outset, I wouldn't see that as being problematic for unauthorized employment, which is a big concern for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Victoria, I think Victoria wants to leave. Victoria, you're in mute.
Sorry.
I think,
There we go.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I just want to jump in quickly because I'm actually going to be leading another webinar about the DACA program immigration. And so we have some good news to celebrate, and we're going to be doing that exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
So we'll be celebrating that in a session that's actually starting in about 15 minutes for our UCI awesome. Community, answering questions for our DACA students, our Dreamer students. Our Dreamer Center is going to be participating, and so that's going to be a great moment. I'm sorry I'm going to have to leave this one, but now that my microphone is working better, and thank you for your patience, I do just want to reiterate how much UCI appreciates the participation on our campus of our international students and scholars, the work that we do together. And I really thank everyone who's put this seminar together, because there is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of, it's very difficult to be in that emotional situation. I myself lived as an immigrant for many years in Brazil when I was working and finishing my PhD. And so that uncertainty I'm very familiar with it. And so my heart really goes out to people who are suffering and not sure. And I want to thank everyone on the call today, because having that expertise and knowing what options are does just bring a little bit more security and a little bit more confidence. And I can just say that, as I said, so many things are outside of our control, but UCI is committed to doing everything we can to help. And I want to leave you with one web address, which is the International Center. And from there, you can get your very specific questions answered. I see some of the questions coming up on this call are very specific. And if it's your visa that you're trying to figure out, the International Center is the place to go for direct questions for your concerns. So that is IC for International Center, ic.uci.edu. Once again, ic.uci.edu. There it is on your screen. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Victoria. Bye.
All right, thanks for participating. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's get some more direct questions in. Well, we have Brendan on the webinar. There are a couple of other individuals who right now are stuck outside of the US and are wondering, can I get or apply for an emergency appointment at the consulate? And like, if so, how do you go about that? And what are kind of reasons for that?
Yeah, it's a little difficult to answer under a broad-based answer. I think that, and as I don't want to fudge the question, but as I mentioned to one of the last questions, I think anyone who is sort of unfortunately stuck outside the United States right now, I think that we and they, or they and whomever, would want to sort of review this in a much more individualized basis, and we would want to really look at the overall circumstances, because I've had conversations with some people very recently. They may not, for example, have been engaged in research initiatives, but they may be engaged in initiatives or projects which at the end of the day can still be applied to the idea of mitigating the effects of COVID-19. So, I think to look and review what this person or persons are engaged in would give them, and again, I think not to sort of provide the same answer as the last time, but I think, and just as Victoria noted as well, I think to bring the interested parties together, and by that I mean the individual, the lab or department or appropriate place there, and the international office, is probably the first best place to have the conversation, because then I think it gives a better sense of, okay, what are the possibilities? what are the possibilities from a sort of substantive standpoint of what we may, and we, I would say they, may be able to communicate to an embassy about why it may be appropriate to obtain an emergency visa, or whether and if it would fall under the discretionary parameters. The other thing is, the different embassies have so many different, procedures and protocols that you just got to try and check with that individual embassy, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, checking with the embassy, that has come up a lot. That's a good one. There is another question about folks who are on OPT and who are maybe applying for STEM OPT. Is there any delay that you know of in getting EADs issued, or how does that work?
So I'm just gonna, I think it would be more appropriate in that context to unfortunately defer any questions such as that. I think I would rather defer to these individuals should really have that discussion with the international office, and use the link that was previously shared. What I will say is, in terms of the processing times and things like that, all we can really go on is and are the processing times that are listed by USCIS on their website, which unfortunately don't give us a great deal of guidance. But with all that being said, I think that we should be prepared for some delays in administrative processing and potentially issuance of documents, etc., given that we are in all likelihood going to be seeing USCIS staff being furloughed. And I just don't know how that's going to affect the administrative processing. But I would certainly, any STEM, OPT and related questions, I would urge people to have that conversation with the international office.
Okay, if we have time for one more question, I don't know if you can answer this, but there are some folks who are wondering if, given the pandemic, if there are any delays in getting J1 waivers approved. Have you heard of that?
No, I haven't. I mean, I'll say two things quickly. We process a lot of J1 waivers in our office because the majority of our clients are, foreign national scientists, and I'm right beside the National Institutes of Health. So every foreign national researcher at the NIH, if they're going to leave, are going to need a waiver. What I am seeing is administrative and processing delays within the waiver review division of the State Department. Actually, luckily, just recently, any of the J1 waivers that have been recommended by the waiver review division of the US State Department have been processed fairly quickly, i.e. the final I-612 by immigration have been processed fairly quickly. Now, that's not to say there are not other delays, but if there are delays, I'm seeing them more at the Department of State level in order to sort of bring all the evidence together, bring all the documents together and recommend the waiver. And again, I'm speaking from a no objection standpoint. I'm not necessarily, there are different types of waivers that one can pursue. So that would be probably the best answer I could give you there.
Great. Brendan, do you have a few minutes, or if you have to leave, we want to be really mindful of your time?
No. I got another few minutes. I'm good.
Okay, great. Seems like there are some people still sticking around and there are some questions. There's one question by a student, and I think you helped me answer this question when I was contacting you. The question is, if you get approved for green card base, actually no, different one. And once you get your green card, how long can you switch into any industry for a job like academia industry? But I believe my understanding based on our conversation is that at least for 6 months, you have to be in the same profession based on which, like if you got EB1, is that right?
Yeah, so is that the one, I'm seeing it, if I'm seeing it in the chat box, let's say if you get approved for a green card based on NIW EB2, can you work in any industry? Will that affect your work history towards getting your citizenship? Is that the question?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I want to say sort of two things quickly to that. And this is where it gets kind of interesting how this administration, I think, is applying the regulations. So under a national interest waiver or an extraordinary ability for that standpoint, the two self-petitioned sort of visa categories, there is no offer of employment required, and generally speaking, an individual therefore is not tied to an employer, and as long as they continue to work in the same or allied field, that is fine. Yes, to your point, I think after 6 or 9 months or something like that, if you had filed and been approved for an EB2 NIW as a researcher, and after about 9 months you transitioned away from research, would that be okay? I think that's probably fine, because what was your intent? Well, after, it becomes after sort of 6-9 months, it becomes a little harder to sort of discern what someone's intent was back there. The other slightly more complicated or restrictive reading, I think, that this administration is now applying, and as we've seen more recently, is that under the national interest waiver, part one of the test is, well, does the proposed endeavour carry substantial merit and national importance? Excuse me. And generally speaking, the proposed endeavour is seen as the field of endeavour, right? If I'm doing, HIV research, is that a proposed endeavour that is substantial merit and national importance? Well, yeah, of course it is. They have been sort of trying to restrict what the field of endeavour is as to what your employment is. So unfortunately right now, if someone is hoping to transition, I would just be a little bit more cautious than I would have been previously outside of this administration. I'm not seeing anything overtly written up. I'm not overtly seeing any memo. I'm just saying to be a little bit more cautious in the current climate than perhaps one would have been previously. But yes, generally speaking, after final approval of your green card under either EB1 or EB2, I would say 6 to 9 months continuing in the same field would be prudent.
Okay, there is one question about foregoing the visa. Okay, this is, can you please comment about the foregoing interviews by USCIS for I-485 applicants with approved I-140 for national interest waiver EB2?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Is it in the chat box as well?
Yeah.
I mean, basically what happened was okay, I see it. Again, it seems like a bit of a case-by-case basis, to be honest. I mean, immigration, one of the problems with USCIS and things like that is there's a lack of consistency across the board. So many years ago, everybody used to be called in for interviews. And then at some point in the past, I can't remember exactly when, I think it was under the Obama administration, but it doesn't really matter. They made a sort of determination that, especially for self-petitioned applicants, what was the point in bringing somebody in for an in-person interview when a service center could in effect make the determination? They had already made the determination that the person qualified, and therefore they could make a determination based upon the evidence in the record, i.e. letters of employment, W-2s, pay stubs, that they were continuing to work in their field. This administration then sort of rolled things back, as they are apt to do, and say, well, all employment-based applicants, we are going to require them to come for a final interview. Then COVID happened, and so they started rolling that back again. So basically over the last 2 to 3 months, I've seen a number of cases whereby so obviously all the in-person interviews were being postponed. So I've seen a number of cases whereby the case obviously shifted either back to a service center or remained at a field office, but they were given the discretion to basically ask for the final document. Say all it was missing was a medical exam. The field office of the service center could say, listen, we're happy with everything else. Send us the medical exam and we'll approve the case. So that's what we've seen happening. we're continuing to see that, but now with the reopening of field offices, as I said in my presentation, i.e. just yesterday, I actually got my first in-person interview that had been postponed before COVID that has now been rescheduled for a couple of weeks. So I don't think we have a concrete idea of how they're going to be approaching these, and a person's case could potentially go either way, i.e. final interview or not.
Anka, you have a question, please go ahead.
Yeah, there was one more question that relates to who is affected by the executive order.
Yep.
So if someone is a current PhD student here in the US on an F1 and they graduate and have a postdoc offer at a UC university, can they then change basically to a J1 inside of the US?
Yeah, I mean, again, without getting into the specifics of a question, I mean, generally speaking, an appropriate request for a change of status inside the United States is what we would call a request for an immigration benefit that will be administered by USCIS. And therefore, if the person meets the standard and has the ability to do that, then that can be granted. Some of the problems that people are going to run into, however, unfortunately, are going to be time. How long is this change of status going to take? You know, might they be left without work authorization while the change of status is pending and things like that? So there are other sort of factors, other circumstances, the situation that may play into the reality of whether this is the best scenario to follow. But from a basic standpoint, then there's nothing, it's possible to do, yes, assuming all the paperwork's in order.
Great. What do you think? I think we pretty much, there are a lot more questions. Maybe I can take just one last, but before that we leave, Brendan, do you think it's okay for people to contact in case they have specific questions they would like to ask you, or maybe a free consultation? I'm not sure, that you decide. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. So let me just, you know, for anyone who's here or on the call, I am more than happy to, and as I said in the webinar, I think, so there's a couple of different ways how this would tend to play out. If someone contacts me and I feel that the international office or another resource is a more appropriate or an appropriate forum for them to sort of ask, I will tell them that. I don't necessarily want to have to charge somebody for them where they can get the information elsewhere, number one. Second of all, if somebody contacts me and I've got that information right there, I'll just give it to them and say, don't worry about it. There you go. There's the information you need. If someone wants to contact me about a consultation, i.e. I'm maybe thinking about permanent residence, I'm thinking about a green card or whatever, will you take a look at my CV? Yes, that's one of the things I do all the time. I would welcome people contacting me, and even from an individual basis, I think it's very important to, and as I said this in the webinar, I think it's very important to get that sort of full and frank evaluation of your credentials, especially if you're an early career researcher, because you may be engaged, as I said, in important research. You may have certain publications, presentations, dissemination, etc. Are you there yet? And I think it's important to, it's great if you get the yes, yeah, you've got a great case, you've got a strong case, but there are other visa options out there. And I'm not afraid to tell somebody, for example, it may be premature. You know, ultimately you sort of, I suppose, the idea of make solid, good, informed decisions that's best for you as an individual. And it may not be, you know, I use that phrase, it's not a one size fits all answer. But yeah, I'm more than happy to talk to anyone about these issues.